Hello, everyone. Welcome to this first of our mini lectures, in which I want to start now talking a little bit about the New Testament. What do we mean when we start studying the New Testament? And this very short mini lecture is intended to go especially with these first couple chapters of Ehrman, as we start orienting ourselves into this material, and as we now engage some initial considerations, in particular, this question of what is contained in the New Testament, and also the process by which it came together and how we have these texts. Also, perhaps not surprisingly, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to introduce you to a few biblical criticisms that are closely connected to these initial issues that we'll be dealing with. All right, so first of all, what exactly is the New Testament? What do we mean when we talk about the New Testament? Well, when the New Testament was first being created, written down by these earliest Christians, they didn't think of it as a collection. Instead, these are individual writings that are produced out of particular communities, out of particular contexts, by specific individuals. And when they wrote these, they wrote them down to try to capture, to express, to share their experiences now of their God and their experiences of Jesus and of this earliest Christian community. When they did so, again, they're doing so within very particular contexts. They're also, in some cases, going to be drawing on other sources, particularly other oral and written sources. So what can this look like? Well, for instance, and we'll talk more about this in depth later as we move into these writings, someone like Paul. Paul, now writing letters, is doing so to particular communities often that have challenges or crises, communities that he can't always visit or be with, particularly because he's often, for instance, in prison. And so Paul is going to write letters to these communities, giving them direction and advice. And his individual voice, as well as his individual context that he's writing within, these are going to be very important for how we encounter these texts, how we make sense of them. Likewise, when we get later to, for instance, the Gospel of Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke is going to be very clear that he's actually working with earlier sources. In particular, he references that there are other writings, other Gospels, but he now intends to write his own. And he talks about this in the very first chapters of Luke. So in his case, he is working with oral and written sources to put his own voice, his own expression on the life of Jesus, his life, death, and resurrection. So these stories now, what we have in the New Testament is a collection of writings, a collection of 27 individual writings created by individual authors and communities that gradually come together. Also, it's important to note that when these writings are being created, that of course Jesus and his earliest followers were all Jewish. When they thought in terms of sacred scripture, they thought in terms of the Hebrew Bible. This was the sacred scripture that was established, that was in its final stages of development during this period. And when they're writing then in relationship with these writings from the Hebrew Bible. They're adding on to them, adding on with the Gospels, with the letters, and it's only gradually that their own writings are going to take on this category of being sacred, their own sacred collection alongside that of the Hebrew Bible. Now, this process by which these individual writings come together and are gradually collected into one large collection that is deemed sacred by the Christian community is a process that is referred to as canonization. Canonization now, definition of it, canon is a fancy word, just means a ruler or a measuring stick. And so the canonization process is a process by which a group of writings, a body of writings, comes to be seen as authoritative, that they're used in some way to measure or judge all other things. They're official sanctioned in some particular way. And this canonization process for the New Testament is a very long and gradual process. When these writings are first being put down, first being shared, they're seen certainly as important, as sacred, written as such, but it's only gradually that the community is going to collect them and see them that way and put them together into this authoritative collection. And in particular, and Ehrman does an excellent job of introducing us to this idea, these early Christian communities are incredibly diverse. In many ways, they are far more diverse even than our modern Christianity. They're going to produce a huge range of writings. And they're also, when they encounter the writings that are being collected and shared and passed around, they're going to read them in very different ways. And it's only gradually now, as a very, very long process, that early Christians are going to start deciding which writings to include and which writings not to include. The 27 writings that ultimately come into our New Testament, this is much debated for a very long time. Now, when they do finally come together, it's only as the conclusion of a very long and formative period. So, for instance, all of our writings that actually are included are written within a relatively brief span, written somewhere between the years of 50 and 150, relatively. It's not until much later, not until the late 300s, that it finally becomes established, that it finally comes to be this recognized collection, and a collection that is closed. Of course, part of what this means is it means that there are going to be many writings that don't make it. Many writings that were written as sacred, intended as sacred by their authors and by the communities that collected them, that ultimately don't make the cut. Of course, one of the joys of taking a class like this is, in addition to being exposed to and studying all of the 27 writings that make it, we'll also talk a little bit about some of these that don't. All right, this happens, by the way, why in the 300s, what's going on? There are also some important developments politically that are taking place. In particular, at the beginning of this period, we have the Emperor Constantine, for instance, that you see here in the top right. And he is going to give very particular support to Christianity. And he's going to begin this process, really, of Christianity now struggling with precisely what do we believe, who's in and who's out. Of course, this had been a long process that had been going on for centuries. But now, with support of an emperor, this process is going to intensify. And there are going to be increased hierarchy and controls trying to decide what should be official, what fits and what doesn't. Also, I should mention this process of what's included or what isn't. This also is going to relate to interesting technological developments. In particular, most early writings were done on scrolls. They were done on scrolls that one rolled up, collected together. This was the typical technology. During the Roman period in particular, we have now the use of what's called a codex, what we think of as a book, sheets of paper that are bound together and that can be read now and paged through. This was a new development within the Roman world, used especially for economic exchange. Christians fell in love with it from very early on. And so Christian writings, they're going to start collecting them in books, bound together. And of course, part of that is that changes how you read a text. The order that they're placed in really matters as you read through them. It matters, for instance, that we read Matthew first and then Mark and then Luke. Their order shapes how we read these texts. Likewise, once you start having a book is a closed collection. It's not easy to just add on an extra writing once you've decided that you've bound this thing together. And so this technology is going to help shape the sense of very clearly defined canon and what's in and what's out. All right, canon criticism. Let me say a little bit about first of our biblical criticisms I'm going to introduce here. Canon criticism is now this scholarly approach to these questions of these texts, thinking about this question of canonization. Thinking, for instance, about this process, this long gradual process, and which texts get included and which don't, and why. And so, for instance, analyzing these texts and thinking about where do they fit? Why might this get included? What are some of the issues that might appeal, for instance, to the Christian community that would have this text included, such as, for instance, claiming apostolic authorship, claiming to be written by somebody like Paul or by Matthew. How does that affect this writing and its inclusion, as well as how we read it? Canon criticism also thinks about, for instance, how these texts fit together and how they work, moving from one to the next. So, for instance, reading Matthew first, reading it in immediate proximity, for instance, to the Hebrew Bible, reading it in connection with the rest of the Gospels. And so canon criticism gives us a language then to think about the relationship between these texts and the order of these texts. Canon criticism also helps us to understand why don't texts make it? What is it about this particular text that would be challenging, for instance, to this collection, this authoritative collection that's starting to be put together? And also, and this is going to be an ongoing fascinating challenge with canon criticism, how do we read these texts in relation to one another? So, for instance, as we'll be starting to deal with very soon, how do we read these different Gospels in relationship to each other? All of these now are going to be issues tied up with this question of canonization and canon criticism and how this collection works together. So when you're analyzing these texts, thinking about them as a whole, thinking about what's included, what's excluded, thinking about how this collection works or doesn't work in relation to one another, these are fundamentally questions of canon criticism. They're a way of thinking about these particular texts in relationship to one another. Or the other issue I want to touch upon is an issue now that Ehrman deals with at some length in these chapters, namely this question, do we have the original text? Do we have the original text when we're working with the New Testament? And of course, one of the fundamental challenges is that we don't have the writings by Paul. We don't have the writings by the first apostles. We would love if we did, of course. What do we have? We have instead copies of copies of copies. In some cases, these are actually pretty early. So for instance, that tiny little fragmentary text there that you see, this text P52, this little tiny fragment of the Gospel of John, this is actually dated by scholars quite early, around the year 125. So presumably just a few copies now away from what may have been the original Gospel of John. But usually what we're dealing with is instead something that has passed through many, many hands, many processes of copying before it's come down to us. And what scholars have to work with now is a huge volume of manuscripts. We have more than 5,000 manuscripts now of the New Testament. This incredible wealth. And with this incredible wealth comes a major challenge. Because, as scholars have noted, there are differences. No two of these manuscripts of any significant length agree completely. So what do we do with these differences? How do we make sense of them? Well, first, it's very important to understand, and Ehrman does a good job of noting, most of these differences are very, very minor. Most of them are misspelled words, small changes, small little differences, and often ones that textual critics, we'll talk about in a moment, can figure out what happened. They can figure out, for instance, that somebody just didn't know their grammar well, misspelled something in this way, and somebody came back later corrected it. Also, you might have things that somebody heard wrong, because, of course, one of the challenges in terms of the scribal tradition and how these books are copied is that in some cases they would be copying from one physical copy to another. So staring at one writing as they then wrote another. In many, though, we actually know instead that they heard these texts. They had someone reading them to them as they then wrote them down. So other types of errors that we see, for instance, are people hearing things wrong. So they mishear the word, write it down incorrectly. Somebody later, understandably, comes through and tries to correct it, tries to fix it. And so we end up with lots of small differences, small errors that get introduced into these texts. Well, this understandably may be concerning to many of you. How do we know? Can we trust this text? If, after all, we have so many small errors, how much can we actually trust it? A few things to note about this. First of all, we have far more texts of the New Testament than we do of almost any other ancient text. And most of us don't spend a lot of time worrying and wondering about whether our version of Homer is correct, and whether the Odyssey, whether every word is exactly right, and can we trust the text? Likewise, we don't usually do that with somebody like Plato, for instance, in Plato's Republic. Well, you might well say to me that the New Testament, after all, matters, and matters in a way that many of these texts don't, and matters to people of faith. A couple things to note with it. First of all, the people who were originally collecting these texts, writing them down, copying them, we can presumably expect that these people were trying to do so as carefully and as faithfully as they could. These were not people trying to introduce errors or problems into the text in most cases. They were trying to write them down correctly and accurately. Likewise, the people later going through and changing and correcting them were presumably very well intentioned as well. We can hope that these people were devoted, even inspired in this process now of writing and transmitting these documents from one generation to the next. Also, while it may sound like a dizzying number when we talk about more than 5,000 texts, the reality is that the scholars who work with this, that there are actually a much smaller number of if you will, chains of textual relation. That what happens is we get a text that then is going to be copied many, many, many times. And we can often trace back to these stemmas, these roots, out of which these later texts then come. And so even though there are many, 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 many texts, there are actually a much smaller number of authoritative texts that we're working with. In particular, there are 4 major texts that biblical scholars are going to work with creating the New Testament. 4 great codexes that are all from the 4th century. If you're curious about these, Codex Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Alexandri, and Bezae, and these 4 great codexes. And I should mention that for most of us, textual criticism. Comment on textual criticism for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to these 4 major texts. Textual criticism, this, in terms of biblical criticisms, is probably the least accessible criticism for most of us as students. In order to do textual criticism, you need intense language skills. So you need to be not just fluent in Greek and fluent in even the different local variants of Greek throughout this period, but you should also know all of the other major languages of these manuscripts. You should certainly know Latin, you should probably know Ethiopic, Coptic, Demotic, the list goes on. So needless to say, even scholars, even most of us as scholars, don't have the skills we need to really work closely in this subfield of textual criticism, the subfield now that tries to get for us the best possible manuscript for our modern translations. But, and this is an important but, many scholars, and even to some degree you as students, can appreciate some of the issues surrounding textual criticism. In particular, for instance, scholars with a moderate knowledge of Greek can appreciate some of the small differences and small changes, appreciate why they might matter, as well as also how those issues might come into the text. Even for you working in English, if you want to, if you're fascinated by this subject, you can start looking into some of these differences. And so, for instance, even a study Bible, even a standard study Bible, as well as some more advanced ones, will often note important differences. So not every difference, but important differences between the texts. And sometimes you will see then variants written down into these notes. And these variants, when you see them, you'll see these four strange letters. You'll see S, V, A, and B. And these four letters then refer to those four major codexes. So for instance, you may have a slight difference in wording, and what you'll see in your notes is you'll see that S says one thing, V says another. So Codex Sinaiticus has one reading, Codex Vaticanus has a different reading. Now in this case, that would be pretty important because Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, these are our two most important codexes, and that would be a fairly interesting variant. If S and V agree on something and you get some random difference, for instance, in Codex Bezae, this is going to be much less significant. It's interesting, fascinating, important curiosity, not something that should give you significant pause in terms of whether or not it's the correct text. All right, lots of detail. Needless to say, you don't need to get into all of this. For our purposes, interesting and important to know in terms of textual criticism, this is one that you are not likely to be able to do a lot with, but it's important to recognize that there's some interesting issues underlying our text, some interesting details. All right, so what does all this come to? This short mini lecture now in conjunction with these first chapters from Ehrman. Well, first of all, I want to make sure that I strongly emphasize that when we're talking about the New Testament, what we're really talking about is a collection of diverse texts. We understandably tend to think of this as one unified collection, one book. But it's very, very important for us to realize instead this is lots of individual texts. And these individual texts have a particular life, have a particular perspective. These texts are then collected together over time. They are chosen by the Christian community as being valuable and meaningful. And important to recognize, they choose to collect this incredible diversity. They don't choose, for instance, just a single gospel. They don't choose just one or two letters of Paul. They choose to collect texts that actually are very diverse in their perspectives, and together make them one authoritative collection. Also, and important to emphasize, that while there are lots and lots of manuscripts, and the differences between those manuscripts can matter, are a fascinating puzzle that are intriguing to wrestle with, that we can have reasonable confidence in the text and that we have the right text, but we should always remember that there are some very interesting differences and some differences that can matter, particularly when we get to some more subtle issues, for instance, of theology and community within Christianity. All right, lots more to say. I'll stop there for now with this short mini lecture. I hope that you're enjoying reading Ehrman in these first couple chapters.